I go into my garden, and there on the vine is a lovely pea that I know is unimpeachably delicious. And the peas are swelling in the pod. And I pick that pod, pop it open, and there I have something that I can only ever taste in that situation. A freshly shelled pea off the vine. That is something you cannot buy. You can only do it when you grow it.
Welcome to episode 29 of the Seed Farmer Podcast, the podcast where I want to convince you to harvest seeds from some of the vegetables and flowers growing in your farm or garden, and then to plant that seed out to grow delicious vegetables and beautiful flowers. I'm your host, Dan Brisebois, seed grower at Tournesol Cooperative Farm and author of The Seed Farmer, a complete guide to growing, using, and selling your own seeds. Before we get into this week's city conversation, here are some updates from the Tournesol farm fields and what I've been up to in my own seed life. I've been harvesting a lot of lettuce these days. We grow lettuce in a greenhouse to keep it out of the ambient humidity. Most summers we can have quite a bit of rain at any point in the season. This summer has been dry. We probably wouldn't have had much problem growing lettuce outdoors at all. Of course, you only know this once the weather has happened and not beforehand. There's many different ways to harvest lettuce, and what we do these days is we wait until the seed heads get fluffy on the plant and we can see the mature seed on some of the flowers. We then carefully bend the lettuce into a harvest bin and shake the lettuce head in the bin. Most of the mature seed and fluffies fall into the bin. I make sure not to damage the lettuce plant so that I can come back and harvest from it again next week when there is more mature seed. I place this bin of lettuce seed and fluff in a shady part of the greenhouse. This is actually our nursery greenhouse that is no longer really producing seedlings, so I have a big dry section of it that I use as my seed workshop. So I place this bin here and I let it dry for a few days before screening out anything that isn't seed and winding up with some nice clean seed. We repeat this process weekly for 3 to 4 weeks, and then we've got most of the seed from the plants, and we can pull the remaining plants and do something else with that space in the greenhouse. This weekend is also the St. Anne de Bellevue Garlic Festival. We're cleaning and packing up garlic for our stall not as I speak right now, but the rest of the day today. I'll be giving 2 workshops at this event. One is called 6 Secrets to Growing Big Garlic, and the other is a Garlic Braiding 101, where I'll show a few different ways folks can braid hardneck garlic. I hope the weather is really nice for this event. If you happen to be local, I'd love to see you at the St. Anne Garlic Festival. If you are enjoying the podcast, consider supporting at spreadsheet.farm/support-podcast or follow the links in the show notes. Another way to help support the podcast is to leave a 5-star review. You can also tell all your friends about the show and share your favorite episodes with them. Adam Alexander is this episode's guest. Adam is a filmmaker, writer, and gardener based in Wales. Adam is also the author of the upcoming book, Accidental Seed Heroes: Growing a Delicious Food Future for All of Us. A chance meeting with a delicious pepper in a Ukrainian market in 1989 kicked off Adam's career as a seed detective, tracking down rare, endangered, culturally important, and above all, delicious vegetables from around the world. In this episode, Adam and I talk about how accidental plant breeding has shaped agriculture for millennia and about the seed heroes who are doing that work these days. We talk about what this looks like for a number of crops, including grains, eggplants, and peas. And we wrap up talking about how Adam grows peas for seed in his own garden and why growing seed locally matters for genetic diversity and food security. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Hello, Adam. Welcome to the Seed Farmer Podcast.
Well, hi there, Dan, and thank you very, very much for asking me to be part of your podcast. I'm honored.
It's a pleasure to have you here. When I first read your bio, what I really noticed at first is that you have 40 years as an award winning film and television producer as a background. And that's kind of what I caught first. But the more I read about you, the more I realized that you've been gardening for a long time. Like, this is not just a recent thing that you got interested in. Yeah, so it goes back to your school days. Can you tell us a little bit about how, maybe I guess how you got into gardening? But what I'm always curious about is that moment where you started to realize that seed wasn't just an input for your garden, but something important and that had value in itself.
Sure. I mean, I actually started gardening when I was maybe 5 or 6 years old, and I had my own little corner of my mother's vegetable plot, to grow radishes and things like that. And so it's always been a complete part of the weft and warp of my life, growing things. I'm a country boy, and my mother was a farmer, and so when you grow up with it, it's just, despite the fact that I had a career in the media for the most part of my life, actually, what I came back to always was growing things, and then having an education where I, I was inspired in many ways to grow things because I went to a school that had an enlightened view about punishment. So the tension was spent in the 2 acre biodynamic walled garden of my school. And I had a wonderful gardener teacher and I really quite liked being a naughty kid in the early 60s because it meant I could spend a couple of hours with Mr. Todd in the garden. And that was where I really started to understand a connection, a physical connection with what we grow and what we eat, and also the pursuit of deliciousness. There is no point in growing things that you don't like to eat, enjoy eating. But to answer your question about where did it really happen for me with seed, there's something that I wrote about in my first book, which is I the great thing about being a film and television producer is you get everybody else to do the work. And I I was in, of all places, in Donetsk in the Ukraine, and this was 1989, with the collapse of the Soviet Union happening all around us. And I had a wonderful director who was a vegetarian, and being a vegetarian in the USSR in those days was not a joyous experience, believe you me. The choices were limited, and there was the shops were empty. The economy was screwed. The only place you could get anything that was of quality to eat was to go to the local markets, where you had essentially old age pensioners, elderly women almost exclusively, selling the produce out of their gardens to augment their meager pensions. And it was there that one of the great stalwarts of the food cultures of Eastern Europe is the pepper, the sweet pepper, and it's fundamental to their cuisine. And anybody who's travelled in Eastern Europe will know that every granny has got her favourite recipe for with peppers. And it was there at that market that I came across a woman who was selling peppers, and I up until then was somebody. I'd saved a few bean seeds but essentially I was buying seeds out of a catalogue. And I had very low expectations that this fruit was going to be anything better than what I was already growing from commercially available seed suppliers. And but I brought them back to the hotel. I gave them to the chef, and I thought I should just at least see what it's like. And it was the first of what I call a wow moment. It was a wow moment in my life that I sliced this thing open, bit into this pepper, and it was like nothing I'd ever tasted before. And I thought, wow, this is fantastic. And what happens if I take some seeds, dry them on the windowsill of my hotel, take them home and grow them? And I've been growing that pepper ever since. And that was what really got me thinking about what it is, why local varieties that are fundamental to people's food culture, why they're important, why they matter. And if they're tasty, I want to grow them myself. And I want to see how they will grow in my rather damp corner of Southeast Wales. And it's that trigger what enabled me, as someone who essentially was spending a lot of time traveling, making films, but getting everybody else to do the work, ensured that I could disappear off to markets, go and lean over people's garden fences, talk to farmers when I was out in the countryside, and go looking for these local varieties that were intrinsic to the food cultures in the world in which I was working.
You do mention that you had saved a couple bean seeds before. So
Yeah.
when you opened up this pepper, took the seeds out, were you scared that it might not give the same thing later on? Like, or you were pretty sure that you were going to be getting a pepper, the same pepper when you
I
when
mean, I was pretty sure I was going to get I was pretty sure I was going to get the same pepper, but what I didn't know was, is it going to grow, taking it out of southern Ukraine with its very different climate and growing it in the UK? Would that work? And would it taste the same when I grew it myself at home as it did when I picked it up out of that market? So I was curious.
Mhm.
Um, and I didn't expect it to fail. I've been growing vegetables for long enough to know that, if the seed was viable, I'd get something. And that, in doing it, what it did was first of all, it really got me thinking about what is the relationship we have with what we grow and eat. And the idea of provenance became key. And also the fact that seeds are all our story. The little old lady in that market who has sold me her pepper that she'd been growing in her backyard. This was something she'd been growing since she was a girl, that her mother and father had been growing before them. And that was absolutely at the heart of the story of Ukrainian food culture. And that was a big light bulb moment for me. And I was never worried about whether or not any seeds that I collected from anywhere would grow generally and do quite well in a British climate, particularly because I've got greenhouses and polytunnels, and I can have some control over the environment in which they're growing. And actually, for the most part, that's really worked. There are one or two things that I'd collected which they have a wonderfully, what I call, recalcitrant nature. So many of the sort of particularly folk varieties and FEs and these sorts of traditional crops, sometimes they just go, you know what? I don't want to grow where you've moved me to. I was really happy where I was.
Mhm.
So anthropomorphizing seeds has also been part of the learning experience.
So I was lucky to get an advance copy. Well, I say an advance copy. So as I understand, this book was already published in the UK, but is going to be published in the US in early September. I have an advance copy of The Accidental Seed Heroes, Growing a Delicious Food Future for All of Us. And I've really enjoyed reading this book, and I'm really looking forward to chat a bit with you.
Sure.
And the first thing that I want to ask is the title, The Accidental Seed Heroes. Who are accidental seed heroes? And I'm also curious, what makes them accidental?
Listen, Dan, I mean, thank you for asking the question, because I use the word accidental in the title, but very deliberately, because up until about 200 years ago, first of all, farmers were plant breeders. And for 12,000 years, since we first started to become settled farmers around the world, you had farmers who were essentially selecting through a series of processes, namely observation, curiosity, and the pursuit of crops that were going to sustain and nourish them and become part of their intrinsic food cultures. When we think about plant breeding being something accidental, that's because the changes that happen in a plant's morphology, the biology that's going on, if you like, is happening because of genetic mutations and also additions or changes in the genome of a plant because it's being crossed with something that's slightly different. But the outcomes you can never absolutely determine in advance. And that's something that obviously I write about a lot in the new book, is the fact that the sort of great advances and changes that we've seen in systematic plant breeding, certainly since the end of the 19th century, and absolutely since the understanding of genetics, with Mendel. By the time we get to the 1920s, plant breeding is being done by men and women in white coats. It's no longer in the hands of farmers in the way that it was. This is particularly the case in what I call the global north, America, Europe, where the traditional role of the farmer as the plant breeder is displaced by modern scientific plant breeding. Why are they seed heroes? Why do I call them seed heroes? Because of them, whether they are an indigenous farmer maintaining a landrace or a farmer's variety, securing the diversity and resilience of their local crops, or you are part of a new generation of very, very diverse breeders, freelance breeders, open source breeders, all sorts of different types of breeders, biochemists, I don't care who they are. They're doing something that I think is truly heroic, because unless we are able to maintain and cherish the diversity of foods that we need to nourish ourselves and help to actually build and restore a sustainable planet, we're doomed. And so that's why they're heroes. But I have another message, which I think is really important. I'm a huge optimist, and I feel very positive about the future because I see anyone who is growing food or really clear about the choices they're making about what foods they buy if they're not growing them themselves. And particularly those people who are then starting to save seeds, that they are absolutely part of the solution. We are able to start to restore and build diversity back into our food system. And the moment we save seeds ourselves, we build a connection with those foods that is completely bound up with our own personal story. And you will know that better than anybody, Dan. I mean, yeah. And I think a lot of people simply, they just aren't aware of it. And gardeners and growers are actually not very good at really sharing that truth that particularly seed savers like us absolutely have in our hearts. And I wanted people to kind of recognize that, this is something that we can all be seed heroes by recognizing those things that we love and matter to us, by ensuring that they become part of our own story and our family, and that we remind ourselves, when we talk about heritage and heirlooms and folk varieties and all of these different terms to describe particular types of crops, that these are things that were absolutely just bread and butter to communities as little as 200 years ago. The world we're in today is just a moment in the story of the domestication of crops and our civilizations.
So with this book, you're highlighting different seed heroes, but
Yeah.
you're also showing how what they're doing isn't that complicated. And I know that there's like so much. It is complicated, but you're showing that doesn't have to be that complicated, and that in some ways it's an invitation for all people who grow plants to be seed heroes themselves.
Correct. That's exactly right. I think the thing is that we get weighed down by a sense of powerlessness. There's a political dimension to what I write, is that, the way that, for the most part, the current food system works is it is actually disempowers us, particularly farmers. This desire, if you like, to be in control of our own narrative, it works as much for the, organic regenerative farmer who is growing crops, saving the seeds from those crops, either to grow more or to sell, whatever it is, to trade in some way. It's just as important for us, with our, whether we have a balcony to grow a few pots of herbs on, or a garden or allotment, or whatever it might be. Yeah, you're right. I just want hope that people who read the book, or kind of get what it is that I'm trying to share with them, about the love of not just growing crops to eat, but being able to save their seeds and then act as accidental plant breeders ourselves by selecting, saving, growing year after year. We sort of create our own, what I call gardeners varieties. If we're amateur growers, we call them in the States folks or farmer varieties, land races, whatever you might like term you might like to use. And why is that really a useful thing to do? Because open pollinated, highly heterogeneous varieties, or types of species of crops, have within them this fantastic genetic rather memory. That what their wild parents from all those tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years ago, contain within their genome the memory of, climates that were very different, environments that were very different. And when we grow them ourselves, these crops have a high degree of adaptiveness. They become used. They like to grow where you're growing them. Even the surface of a seed contains the fundamental data of the biome of the soil in which they were grown, which is why you and I know well that when you save seeds, their vigor is greatly increased, because they germinate faster, they grow better, and that's because they're at home. They wake up and think, oh, I know where I am. Boof, off we go. I recognize this soil. And farmers have been doing this for countless thousands of years without actually understanding the science behind it, or anything about what's actually been happening genetically. Now we understand that. We can see why there's a real purpose in us, any of us who are just home growers with a little bit of ground to grow and save something, can be part of that story and help to restore this genetic diversity that we desperately need if we're going to be able to feed ourselves in a very changing environment.
I love what you kind of talking about the seeds and the heterogeneous diversity and the seed surface. What actually occurred to me as you were saying that is the only reason we can be accidental seed heroes is because the seeds are also heroes. Like they're as much
Correct.
a player as we are.
Yeah, I like that. You're right. We can go on forever about what seeds are like, but it is fantastic that you can have this wonderful, precious package of goodness. It's going to keep us alive and happy because we like eating it. And within this tiny package, are all the tools they have, all the resources within them to absolutely deal with the challenges of more extreme climate. I mean, that the thing, this is nothing new. We tend to think of it most, they take it in their stride. The problem is with modern homogeneous cultivars and monocultures is by narrowing the genome, by only retaining the genes that somehow are the breeder or the producer, usually the agribusiness, thinks provides the solution. The trouble with doing that is that you actually create these huge vulnerabilities, because these modern genetically narrow cultivars are actually, they're not equipped to be able to cope with change, which is why you then have this endless treadmill of the poor farmer is in servitude to the seed company and the chemicals company, because next year they're going to have to change the seed they use, because whatever it is that they've had before has either built some resistance or doesn't like the fact that it was wetter last year than the year before, or whatever it might be. And so this heterogeneity of seeds, this fantastic knowledge that they contain within them, is part of our salvation. I mean, one of the things, it's really interesting, we endlessly, us know-alls in the global north, and this is the thing that winds me up big time, is we know best. You guys in Africa, you guys in India, you ignorant peasant farmers, take our GMO maize because this is what's you're going to get super crops, and it's going to, everything's going to be fine. Oh, and by the way, we're supplying the seeds, and you need all these chemicals and whatever. Or even if you don't need the chemicals, you can't own the seeds, you can't save them. You have the intellectual property in that seed belongs to us, not to you, the farmer. The point I'm trying to make is that when you look at how indigenous farmers continue this tradition of being accidental plant breeders, because they are maintaining and selecting from their local varieties, their local farmers' varieties, which are brilliantly well adapted to growing in their corner of the world. And that actually you can go a few miles down the road and a farmer will be growing something that looks almost exactly the same, but actually is slightly different, because that has been selected often over generations and is just a little bit different because of the biotic and the abiotic stresses and environments in which it's growing have enabled bits of the genome of that plant to kind of wake up because they've got a use. And what I found particularly with indigenous farmers in sub-Saharan Africa, they're not alone, and also in India, is that they don't have a concept of climate change. They don't agonize like we do. God, are we going to be, we're going to go over 1.5 degrees? That's it. The world is over. Because when you rely on the rains, are they going to come on time? Are they going to be too much or too little? And that they don't know that from one year to the next. The idea that there's this sort of gradual sort of decline in our ability to feed ourselves because the climate is warming up is sort of alien to them, because every year they don't know what's going to happen to them. And so the way that they approach how they grow things is absolutely about how do we build resilience into our system? How can we be sure that regardless of what happens to the weather, I'm going to be able to feed my family. I'm going to be able to feed my community. I'm going to have something to sell in the market. These are the people we need to be listening to and collaborating with and learning from, as much as then applying our profound and deep understanding of genetics and plant breeding to be able to enrich also the diversity of crops that are starting to become available.
I want to talk a little bit more about the book before we pivot into talking shop. The book is broken into, chapters, as books are. And the first one or two are kind of more about plant breeding and the history of plant breeding. And then you go into a number of chapters focused on different crops. I'm kind of curious in the writing of the book, how did you wind up selecting these crops for the book?
There were some obvious ones. So the most obvious ones were cereals, um, and the how if we think about the journey of wild parent to cultivated offspring and the process of selection that has been going on with many crops, you weren't necessarily things weren't necessarily happening that were having a fundamental impact on the DNA of those crops, except with cereals. So cereals are really interesting because you can have two completely different species that will cross and combine. And this is something that's happened with grasses, with wheat. The reason why we have bread wheat today is because of accidental crossings that were happening between two completely different species of grass. And I love that the idea that then you have these Neolithic farmers from thousands of years ago who notice these changes and then exploit those changes by selecting, saying we're only going to grow the seeds from these particular grasses that have shown these changes that we like. Primarily non-shattering, that was the first key difference. But then, how hard is the kernel? What could they be used for? Lots of different reasons. And so I wanted to put in cereals because it's a bit of fun. But, there is a question. It's like, who domesticated who? Was it us that domesticated wheat or wheat that domesticated us? And it's to me, it's a fun idea, but at its heart is something really important about how different families and species of crops behave differently genetically, and how profound that is on how we have been able to evolve as a species ourselves and how we can continue to survive. There were other crops that I was interested in because they were telling a very different story. So one of them is eggplant. There's a big debate about the use of GMOs in plant breeding. And I wanted to explore that subject through an example of a crop which was of not particular interest to the Monsantos of this world. They're not interested in eggplants. There's not enough money in it for them. But there was something that was interesting that they were able to apply to genetically modifying eggplant, which was all to do with the inclusion into their genome of the DNA of a bacillus, which essentially attacks the caterpillars that were destroying the crop. We've seen this BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, I think it's thuringiensis, forgive my Latin, which is being used in cotton. I think it's been used in tobacco, in maize, in kind of these huge GM monocrops. But it was interesting for me with eggplant was that basically Monsanto weren't interested. In America, I think there was the USDA and Cornell University kind of got their heads together and put up some money to be able to acquire the rights, the intellectual property rights to that BT genes to do work on eggplant originally in India. And then the Indians kind of were very, very unhappy about including this GMO in their plants, and it was banned, and there was lots of big hassle about it, quite understandably. But what was interesting was that in Bangladesh government said, okay, we're going to allow BT brinjal, as they call it there, brinjal, the local name for eggplant. And it was done as a collaboration. So there was a real element of participatory breeding that was going on that involved farmers. And it has had a transformative effect on the health and well-being of countless hundreds of thousands of farmers in Bangladesh. First of all, they're not poisoning themselves with chemicals, and they're not, and they're starting to make a profit out of growing their crops, which means they can feed themselves and their families more effectively. There are lots and lots of negatives associated with using GMOs in this way because the crops build up resistance. There are real problems with these genes getting out and crossing with other varieties. And so there are all sorts of mechanisms that are being used to create barriers in order to maintain the sort of BT element of brinjal within a sort of manageable environment. And again, it sort of, to me, demonstrates the real challenge of, if you like, putting oneself into a growing environment where you are still essentially enslaved to a system of plant breeding, which ultimately is there for the benefit of the multinationals and their stockholders, and over which the farmer is really unable to maintain control. Actually, with farmers in Bangladesh have been able to, because many of these varieties are open pollinated, have been able to save their own seeds and start to develop their own cultivars. The other thing I really found interesting about writing about eggplants is then what happened. Farmers are human beings after all. And so there's been this transfer of genetic material from Bangladesh back into India because Indian farmers have seen what Bangladeshi farmers have been doing and said, hang on, we want a piece of this. And so, you go to the market and there you can buy a GMO bunch of plants, in the market to go and put in your field. Of course, everybody jumps up and down about this, and particularly the anti-GMO activists. I quite understand, they have their agenda. But actually, if I'm a poor and particularly illiterate farmer, I have no concept or understanding of what genetic modification means. All I know is that if I plant that crop, it's not going to get eaten by caterpillars, and I don't have to spray it with a load of chemicals, which I can't afford to buy, and which, in any event, are making me sick. So there's this very human side to it that makes the story of how we think about GMOs not one that is black and white, but one which is a whole series of grays. It's not an easy thing to be able, there's no pat answer about what is right or what is wrong.
I do like that you brought up the story about the eggplants because it is one that struck me, and something that I appreciated in your book is, so you definitely are talking about farmers' varieties, land races, and evolutionary populations. Like, there's definitely you're putting forward these approaches to seed, which is, a lot of the way that I work with seed, and a lot of people on this podcast. But you also talk about molecular breeding, and you talk about it. I mean, you're not like endorsing it blindly, but you talk also about what it does have to bring in specific situations, and what some of the challenges are that come afterwards, especially in the eggplant chapter. You talk about having to maintain reserves for the caterpillars so that they're able to still be resistant to the BT in the plants. So it's something that I did enjoy in this book, how, and you mentioned it being this interview, is the accidental seed heroes are not just farmers. It is all the people in the system, even in the labs, are part of it. So it's something that I think it's good for us to kind of keep an eye on that whole picture. So I appreciated that.
Thank you. I mean, I think it's really, we find ourselves in silos. It's so easy for us to kind of create a polarized debate about what we should or shouldn't be doing. And we understand the importance of heterogeneity and diversity in our seeds and in our crops. But it applies, I believe, in our lives across everything that we're doing. And so there is no one answer. There is no one particular way. I mean, we talk about it with energy. We need diversity of energy supply. It's got to come from lots of different sources. It's exactly the same with food and seed. And so to me, the scientist, the geneticist, and the botanist are absolutely as important a part of how we continue to find a path through to genuinely being able to grow and feed all of us. And at the same time, can we get to a carbon neutral environment in terms of food production and restore biodiversity and goodness to our soils? All of those things can only happen when everybody is involved and it's very clear about where the positive contributions to the solution are being made. And I think particularly with molecular plant breeding, the real challenge is that we have to continue to champion when molecular plant breeding is done in a genuinely collaborative way, which actually puts the interest of the farmer first. And of course, that's how it always was. We always thought of food and seeds as commons, as something that was there for all of us. When we commodify our food, which is what we've been doing for the last century or more, we lose that connection as growers. And there's a real kind of paradox in all of this. You think 100 years ago, there were 2 billion people on the planet. Today, we got 8 billion, I know, going on. And the only reason why we got 8 billion people on the planet is because actually we're able to feed ourselves. And we've been able to do that principally because somebody like Norman Borlaug, who to me is, for many they think him of as a demon. He to me is an absolute hero, is that he was still working with open pollinated crops. He was still breeding in a traditional way.
Do you want to just give a little bit more background?
About Borlaug?
Yeah.
Well, Norman, back in, Mexico, if you think, which is the center of diversity for maize in the world, by the time we got to the 1930s and into the period of the Second World War, they were starving. They couldn't feed themselves. And Borlaug started to develop these much more high-yielding cereals in the first instance, such that Mexico became an exporter. It suddenly wasn't starving anymore. And there were lots of things that he was doing with cereals. They had shorter stems. They didn't lodge so much. They were high yielding. They needed inputs. And then this got picked up by, bearing in mind, this was work that was being supported by the US government and universities and institutions. This wasn't agribusiness doing this stuff. But then by the time we get into the late 40s, early 50s, suddenly this way of thinking about how we would breed crops started to happen primarily with maize, but with lots of other crops, pulses in particular. And hence, suddenly we could produce a lot more food on a lot less land and feed a growing population. But of course, we paid a terrible price. And Borlaug was a visionary. He won the Nobel Peace Prize. It was not Peace Prize. He won the Nobel Prize, I don't know, for science, agriculture, something. But in his acceptance speech, he reminded us that, I can't remember when he received it, but I think, it's in the middle of the 20th century. He reminded us that everybody needed to be part of this journey, most particularly the farmer. But nobody listened to him because the agribusinesses weren't interested. They didn't want to talk to farmers. They just wanted to produce the next sexy crop that they could sell to farmers. And how we then unpick ourselves from this situation that we found ourselves in, this amazing success story of being able to feed 8 billion people and grow vast amounts of crops on small amounts of land. How we restore our land how we recover the diversity of crops, how we empower farmers is, I think, fundamental to how we, and ourselves as individuals growing, that's fundamental to how we solve this looming existential problem that we face of not having ground we can't grow things in, the law of diminishing returns, which we see in modern monoculture, homogeneous agriculture.
If you're already a seed farmer, or even just thinking about harvesting seed from your plants for the first time, head over to seedgrowers.farm for my free seed grower resources. There is cross-pollination information, seed yield information, even a few seed spreadsheets. There's also a list of my favorite seed books and podcasts. While you're there, you can also sign up for my weekly newsletter to get seed grower tips and stories straight into your inbox. So head to seedgrowers.farm for my seed grower resources. Now, back to the show. I'm going to take us away from this larger discussion, which is a really important one, and one that I think is great that you brought into the Accidental Seed Heroes. And let's talk about your growing. Every episode, I like to have a deep dive conversation into a crop with our guest. And you said that you are known as a bit of a pea nut, and that you would love to talk about peas. Maybe you could tell us a bit about why you love growing peas, and then we can kind of get into the actual growing and for seed.
Sure. So, well, Dan, be careful for what you wish for. Is
that a whole other podcast series?
The pea is one of the founder crops from the Fertile Crescent, which, is the Near East, Eastern Mediterranean, Middle East, North Africa. That it is native to essentially the Eastern Mediterranean and parts of North Africa. And so the story of the domestication of the pea is a really interesting story about how of civilization, and how these wild varieties were domesticated and behaved in different ways. And I've always loved going into my garden. It's a sunny day. It's sort of late May, and I grow mostly very tall varieties of peas, because peas are traditionally a climbing plant. They grow tall. Short varieties are a result of highly selective plant breeding that's happened over the last century and a half. And I go into my garden, and there on the vine is a lovely pea that I know is unimpeachably delicious. And the peas are swelling in the pod. And I pick that pod, pop it open, and there I have something that I can only ever taste in that situation. A freshly shelled pea off the vine, that is something you cannot buy. You can only do it when you grow it, or you're invited into somebody's garden to eat them. And the pea has been a kind of a breeding obsession, particularly in North America and right across Northern Europe. It was a 19th century obsession. Again, this reminds us about how we used to be so viscerally connected to what we grow and eat. And at the end of the 19th century, in a book that is just a fantastic read, The Vegetables in New York, I counted the number of peas that are listed in that book. It's over 1,000 varieties. So, 120 years ago, over 1,000 varieties of pea were being grown in the USA. There were about 250 varieties being grown in the UK. There were countless numbers being grown in, Germany, Sweden, Scandinavia, Russia, you name it. We were all growing peas. And you had these amateur gardeners as well as professional horticulturalist farmers who were doing, some of them were genuinely selecting from accidental crosses or sports or mutations and growing from those. Others were deliberately cross pollinating and breeding new varieties. Many were simply taking a variety, reversing the name, claiming it for their own. So, plant breeders can be a bunch of dodgy people too, who are quite happy to purloin somebody else's work. But I think what the pea breeders and growers were demonstrating was that it's not that long ago that actually we as the world was obsessed with peas. And there are so many stories I could tell you about peas, how they got their names, how they won the hearts and stomachs of diners all over the world. And I love them. And I'm always on the lookout for peas. I mean, my absolute favorite go-to pea is one called Aviyuan, and I found it in Catalonia. There's a wonderful guy who lives in Catalonia, in Spain, northeastern Spain, an independent part of northeastern Spain, and he grows basically local varieties of crops, and he has 150 in his collection. You realize Catalonia is not a big place. Boy, do they have a lot of local varieties, including one, this pea, called Avi Yuan. And it was another wow moment for me. I went to see him, and what he had a beautiful organic farm. And I walked into this sort of forest of peas. It was around my birthday, late May. And of course, there they all are, waiting to be plucked. There were these big pods full of big fat peas. And when I sprung one open, I thought, well, I'm not sure if this is going to work. It is still, I have not found, for me, a more delicious pea. And it was bred by his wife's grandfather and named after, it was bred by his wife's grandfather and named after her grandmother, Avi Yuan, Avi Joan. So her grandfather was one of the last of this incredible cohort of obsessive growers and breeders of peas. He gave me some seed. I was so lucky. I was so lucky to meet him because, I said to him, Jesus, this is amazing. Who else is growing it? And he said, well, nobody else is growing it, only me. And I said, so you and I, we're not getting any younger. What happens when you shuffle off this mortal coil? What's going to happen to that pea? And he said, well, I don't know. The kids, they're in Barcelona. They're not really interested in taking on the farm. I'll sell it. I don't know what will happen to the collection. Probably just go. And I said, that cannot be allowed to happen. And he gave me some seeds. And of course, I started to grow them. And these things grow to 2.5 meters. They are giants. And they're just brilliant. And I was then able to share some of those seeds with the Heritage Seed Library in the UK, which is the sort of holds the national collection, if you like, of heirloom and heritage and ex-commercial varieties. With his permission, he was very happy for me to do that. And then I started sharing the seeds myself of the crops that of my surplus. And now that pea is safe. Its genes are not going to be lost. And there are so many peas that I've come across that are in this very precarious situation. And they're not the only crop, but when there are just so many different ones that you can eat and so many that are synonymous with others, which tells you how they've traveled from one part of the world to another.
One of the things with growing peas, you're growing the vegetable that has the
Yeah.
seed in it. Is there anything that you do different when you're growing a pea crop for seed than just for vegetables?
I don't do anything differently when I'm growing for seed or vegetables because I want to eat them and save the seeds at the same time. I think my approach to growing peas is I'm British. I like things to be organized in my garden relatively. So, I will grow my peas, each pea a couple of inches apart in a double row, 4 or 5 inches wide, and stick up pea canes usually. I mean, I'm lucky I can cut 10-foot hazel canes to support my giant peas. And that's how I grow. So I have a very conventional approach to growing peas. And that's in part also because I really want to understand how they grow. Because traditionally, peas traditionally were tall. They were always tall. And most farmers, rather like Jesus Vargas, my friend in Catalonia, but also like many other indigenous farmers that I've met, and most recently in Ethiopia, I can tell you a bit about the peas that I've come across there, is that they just let them ramble. And so you've got no real idea of just how long
It's
they
just like
are
a bush.
and how far they have to grow. That's right, and how long far they have to grow before you start to get the first flowers. And so there can be frustrating things about a pea that grows to 7 foot. If it's grown to 5 foot before you get the first flowers, you need quite a lot of them. You need patience and you need good strong supports. And the thing I love about peas is they're also very much a great way of looking at how plant breeding has evolved. And one of the things I write about in the Accidental Seed Heroes is one of the stalwarts of British cuisine is the frozen pea. Everybody buys frozen peas. And what I didn't realize is that in America, that frozen peas are really for schools and prisons, that they're not. Whether or not that is true, I don't know, but that was what I was told. Whereas in the UK, it's peas with everything. And we have the the modern pea that we can freeze due to an accident. And it was an accident of a mutation that happened in a field of conventional peas that were quite tall, but were also being grown for drying, because essentially peas are a dry crop, not one that, I mean, we eat them fresh, but when you've got peas crops that are tall, it's actually really difficult to harvest them as a fresh crop. And this guy who's walking through his field of peas, and he notices one that looks a bit different, and it has hypertendrils on it, and he sees an opportunity to, can I do something different with my peas to make it a more viable crop? And actually the story of how that accident, that genetic accident, and an observant farmer started an amazing story of the development and the breeding of the modern leafless pea that all matures exactly at the same time, that you can run through it with a combine and harvest it, and within an hour and a half it's in a packet deep frozen, is absolutely, to me, a fantastic example of how modern plant breeding has had a profound impact on our diet, but actually in a very good way. So with peas, if you want to have a frozen pea business set up by Mr. Birdseye, American, kicked it all off, that you need your farms to be close to the factory where they're processing them. And you need the farmers to know that this is a profitable line for them. So it's a great example of a story of a collaboration between plant breeders, seed producers, and farmers, and then a big food producer. And that they've worked very closely together. It's a fabulous collaboration. And of course it is continuing to evolve, because nothing is static in the world of plant breeding, as you know, and seeds. Things change and evolve, and because the climate is changing, we have to think a little bit differently, particularly about disease resistance and other factors. And that's another reason why I absolutely love the pea, that it has this very modern story, but it's also a crop that is very important in terms of building resilience into our food system. So I was in Ethiopia in March 24 doing research for this book. And I had been working with some wonderful ethnobotanists at Kew, and one of them, Philip Orion, said, "Look, I've been up into the highlands of the Rift Valley, up at about 2,500 meters. I don't know what that is, 8,000 feet above sea level." And she had been looking for something else as an ethnobotanist. And she said, I came across this farmer who was growing peas. And she said they were really interesting because all the flowers were different colors. And that immediately got me thinking. And fortunately, she had the GPS coordinates for this farm, and I had a wonderful driver, Ermias, and we disappeared up into the mountains in the middle of nowhere in southern Ethiopia, and came across this wonderful farmer and his son, Mohammed, and his son, and started talking about peas. And he was growing peas as a population. That's again something that ties in with things that I write about in the book about cereal populations, about growing different varieties of the same crop together. And the absolute opposite of monoculture. And he was doing this with peas. And it was brilliant because he could eat them fresh. And some of them had very small peas, like petit pois. Some of them had a little slightly bigger peas. He could dry the crop and have them as dried peas, part of Ethiopian cuisine. He would grind them up as pea flour, really important, and he could feed them to his animals. I mean, tell me, what's not to like about a crop like that? Anyway, he gave me some seeds, which I've brought home. And actually this year, I grew them this year for the first time. I thought I'll just grow a few. And I'd asked him, how do you grow them and harvest them? And it's all done by hand, and they're just allowed to ramble in the field. Anyway, so of course, I grow them in the British way, a couple of rows, lots of stakes. And these things, they're growing to 6 foot, 2 meters. And they're really interesting because incredibly heavy crops, unbelievable. And they're essentially two distinct flower types. There's the white flower, and then there's a sort of two-tone pink-purple flower. And the white flower has a pea in it, which is like a petit pois. Actually, very nice as a fresh pea. The pods are small. It's not a commercial, no commercial breeder would look at it because why do you want to grow a little small pea? You want to grow a great big pea, make more money. But really nice as a fresh pea. And then the other one was a slightly bigger pea, dark color, actually perfectly tasty as a fresh pea, but not my number one by a long shot, but a really perfectly good quality pea. And then I've eaten a few. I actually put a few in the deep freeze because I want to see how well they work when they come out of the freezer. And the rest I'm just leaving to dry. And I'm going to save a few because I like having dried peas in my larder to keep me going through the winter. And do you know what? I'm going to put a load through a flour mill and make some Ethiopian pea flour, and then figure out what I'm going to do with it. But it's so exciting and inspiring for me that there are these farmers who are living in some of the most challenging environments in the world, who have got a way. They've figured out if we grow lots of these different peas together, and some of them will cross and they mix, and we don't try and select out the seeds. We just take the seeds year after year and grow them. It doesn't really matter what happens, whether the rains are early or late, whether there's too much or too few, they are going to get a crop. It can be better some years than others, but they aren't going to starve. And that is a lesson for all of us.
Definitely. And I think this is actually a really good time to transition to kind of the wrap-up questions, which is about lessons, I guess. What would you tell your younger seed-growing self to help them on their journey?
I've only been saving my own seeds in a very conscious and building a collection and trying to develop my own locally adapted varieties for the last 35 years or so. So, I wasn't a young man when that started. I was already in my I was in my 40s. And so, but if I go back to when I was really getting interested in growing in my early and mid 20s, and I had a horticultural business, market garden in the mid 70s, I was 25. actually, I had then I had no real awareness of what these seeds really were. And I then look back and I think at the new generation of people in their mid 20s, early 30s, who are really embracing horticulture and growing and saving seeds, and also growing for seed, which is happening more in the UK. Nothing like it is you guys in North America, but I love them to bits because actually if I was their age back then in the mid 70s, that's what I would be doing now. I would absolutely be focusing on how do I build resilience into my um, um, horticultural business for the crops that I'm selling in the market, which is to be able to focus on cultivars that are really designed for low input. And that means I need heterogeneous, genetically diverse cultivars that don't need loads of input. And so how I am growing them is really important. I mean, I'm an organic grower. I have been literally all my life. So, that bit of it, I kind of don't think I need to change much. Focus a lot more on the quality of my compost, but be like those traditional farmers and select from the seeds of the crops that I'm growing and saving seed from to ensure that what I'm growing in the next year and the year after are ever better adapted and useful to me for resilience, but also for my business, and connecting my customers with what it is that I'm growing. So they become part of the story. They feel they take some ownership of it themselves. Because that once somebody is buying your seeds or listening to your voice as a seed producer, and how do you do this as a business, actually, it's all about your relationship with the end user that really matters.
So this might be actually a good pivot point, but what would you say to market growers who currently grow vegetables or herbs or flowers but don't keep any of their own seed? What would you say to them to inspire them to start keeping some of their seed?
Well, first of all, I'm not going to tell anybody what they should do. I think, yeah, this is what I would do. I think that what I put into the heads of these types of growers, and I know a number of them in the UK, is just try it. You don't need to go cold turkey, and don't buy any seeds from a modern, from whoever it is, your regular sort of commercial seed supplier. First of all, if you're buying seeds, buy local. Provenance is everything. I don't know about you, but I like to know where my cheeses come from. Or, if I'm buying a leg of lamb, I like to think pretty fairly sure that I know the farm it came out of. And we care about that now. And we're caring more and more about the provenance of our food. We have to care about the provenance of our seed. And so that to me is the starting point. Can I grow something that has been grown by somebody else locally as a commercial grower? So they're providing me with seed. Can I then become part of that, if you like, family or community of growers who are also sharing that genetic material? That's one of the things I love about open source plant breeding is, look, you can use my seeds to help to evolve and develop things that work for you, and to use it to increase the diversity of what's out there. So I think thinking that way about seeds is really important. And then start by saving the seeds of things that are easy. And actually, if you're growing herbs, it's pretty easy to save seeds from herbs. You just let them go to seed and off you go. And the great thing is, as we all know, you don't need, for many types of crops, you don't need that many plants to go to seed before you've got more than enough seed to see you through your next cropping season. If you're growing 1,000 lettuces a year for your market stall, actually, the truth is one lettuce plant will give you all that seed. So it doesn't have to take up a lot of space. And then you become part, I would say, you become part of this experiment, this journey. and try it with things that are easy, that don't easily cross-pollinate. So, peas are a really good example. Just leave them on the vine to dry, and then do a comparison. The peas that I've saved seeds from, are they growing better than the seeds that I've bought from some commercial grower where I've got no idea where they've come from? Are they growing as well as the seeds that were grown and being sold by that local seed producer in the same state or the same corner of the US? Join the club. That's what I say.
Is there something that I should have asked you that I didn't ask you?
I think, first of all, seed saving is not difficult. I think that's one of the things. I think where this real skill comes in is in how you select. If you're becoming consciously a plant breeder, this is something different, and that's very exciting, but you have to be obsessive. If you're Craig LeHoulier, or if you're, there are a wonderful large number of women and men in the US who are just obsessed about a particular crop, and they want to breed them and work on them and improve them. And that's very, very exciting, but that's not for all of us. Whereas, and they are still accidental plant breeders in the same way, because they don't know what they're going to get until they get it. And, but for us mere mortals who don't think of ourselves as plant breeders in that sense, but think of ourselves as custodians of genetic diversity and part of the evolutionary change that we need to see happening with crops, is that it's the easy bit is actually growing the crop. The really exciting bit is then seeing that crop and identifying those bits of it that you really want to hang on to, and work with in the next generation, and on and on and on. My own example is, goes back to what you asked, the very first question you asked me, which is about, how did this all happen? And I think of that Donetsk pepper, which I've been growing for 35 years, and I've probably got 30 accessions of that pepper. Well, my little wet, damp corner of East Wales is not the ideal place to be growing peppers outside. But my Donetsk pepper, perfectly happy growing outside. It's the first pepper to flower. It crops for the longest period of all the peppers that I grow. Most importantly, it is absolutely delicious. It's fruity and sweet, has a lovely hint of spice to it. It's fabulous. And now it's effectively become a Welsh landrace, farmer's variety, gardener's variety, dare I say. I'm not a farmer, I'm a gardener.
I think that wraps up all the threads pretty nicely.
I'll
So,
bring it together.
how can people find out more about what you're doing?
Well, please come and visit my website. You just Google the Seed Detective, you'll find me, or see me on Instagram. I'm also doing a tour. I mean, I wish I was a rock star, because I could then say I'm doing a coast-to-coast tour of the USA. But I'm going to be at Common Ground up in Unity in Maine, middle of September. Then I'm doing a book signing in Rizzoli in New York a week or so later. Then I'm across to the West Coast to do a couple of events in the Bay Area. And then I'm going to Mansfield in early October to participate in the big Baker Creek Festival. So if any of your listeners find themselves in the same neck of wood that I am, it'll be great to see you. And you can find out details of that on my website or Instagram.
Well, thank you so much, Adam, for having this conversation with me. I really appreciated it.
Well, Dan, thank you. And I can't tell you how chuffed I was when you asked me to come and speak to you, because you are a bit of a hero of mine. Rest assured, you are a proper seed hero.
Well, thank you for that endorsement. Have a great season, or a great continuation of your season.
Thank you, and the same to you, buddy.
And that's episode 29 of the Seed Farmer Podcast. Thank you, Adam, for being on the podcast, and thanks to Chelsea Green for sending me an advance copy of Accidental Seed Heroes. You can find links to the Seed Detective in the show notes. You can currently pre-order Accidental Seed Heroes. Thank you to Cepheus et Delton for the theme music. You can hear more of their music at cepheusetdelton.com. Thank you to Molly Brisebois for editing this episode, and thank you so much for joining me in these conversations with seed farmers. You can find more seed growing resources on my blog at seedgrowers.farm. While you're there, you can subscribe to my newsletter full of seed growing, crop planning, and farm spreadsheets. You can also find out where to order a copy of my book, The Seed Farmer, A Complete Guide to Growing, Using, and Selling Your Own Seed. And you can support the podcast at spreadsheet.farm/support-podcast. The link is also in the show notes. If you haven't already subscribed to this podcast, now's the time. You wouldn't want to miss next episode. Until then, happy farming.